There of the continent Atlantis, who then constituted the learned society under the name Achaldan. Certain members of this society, who already had some notion of the sacred omnipresent Ochidanoch, discovered, by their persistent labors, how to obtain from their own atmosphere, and also from certain surplanetary formations, each of its sacred parts separately. And by keeping these sacred cosmic force-bearing substances in a concentrated state, how to perform, with their help, their definite scientific elucidatory experiments. The learned members of the said Great Learned Society then also discovered, among other things, that they could, by means of the separately localized third part of the omnipresent Ochidanoch, namely by means of its sacred neutralizing force, or force of reconciling, bring every kind of planetary what are called organic formations into such a state that they remained forever with all those active elements contained in them at the given moment. That is to say, they could stop and absolutely arrest their future inevitable what is called decay. The knowledge of the ableness of such an actualization passed by inheritance to certain beings of this Egypt, namely to those initiated beings who were the direct descendants of the learned members of the Alcaldans. Well, many centuries after the loss of Atlantis, beings of this Egypt, on the basis of the knowledge which had reached them, also discovered how, by means of that same sacred neutralizing force of the sacred Ochidanoch, to preserve the planetary bodies of certain of them forever in a non-decaying and non-decomposing state after the sacred Roscoano, or as they say, after death had proceeded in them. And indeed, by the time of my 6th visit to that planet, all the beings and everything which had been in this Egypt during my former visit had entirely ceased to exist, and not even any notion of it all was preserved. But those planetary bodies upon which they employed the mentioned means remained intact, and exist there, even to the present time. And these surviving planetary bodies are called by the contemporary beings mummies. The transformation of the planetary bodies into mummies was effected by the beings of Egypt by a very simple means. Namely, they kept the planetary body assigned for this purpose about half a month in what is there called castor oil, and later they introduced into it the sacred substance force, dissolved in a corresponding way. Well, my boy, according to the researches and investigations of one of our countrymen who exists there even up till now, about which I was informed by an etherogram after my final departure from the surface of your planet, it turned out that once, when their process of reciprocal destruction began between the community of the beings breeding on this Egypt and the beings of a neighboring community, and when at the same time one of their, as they are called, pharaohs came to the end of his existence, the beings whose business it was to preserve the bodies of meritorious beings everlastingly were unable, owing to the approach of beings hostile to them, to keep the planetary body of this pharaoh in castor oil as long as was necessary, that is to say, half a month. But nevertheless, they put this body into castor oil, placed it in a hermetically closed room, and having dissolved in a certain way the said sacred substance force, they introduced it into the said room, so as to obtain in this way what they wished. This definite sacred something would have remained for untold centuries in its pristine state among these three-brained beings who have already long ago no reverence in their essence. But as in the presences of these contemporary, as it is possible to call them, unconscious sacrilegists, a criminal passion has arisen that evokes in them a need to despoil even the sanctuaries of beings of past generations. They dug down even into this chamber which ought to have been for them a profoundly revered sanctuary. And they committed that blasphemous deed whose result is now the cause of my becoming aware with all my being of my mistake. Of just that mistake I made when I so confidently assured you that nothing whatever had reached the beings of the contemporary civilization from the beings of epochs long past. Whereas this said contemporary Egyptian event is a consequence of one result which reached them of the attainments of these ancient ancestors of theirs who used to exist on the continent Atlantis. Such a result of the scientific attainments of beings of long, long past epochs reached the contemporary beings and became their possession for the following reason. Perhaps, my dear Hussein, you already know, like all the responsible beings of our great universe, and even those still only at the period of the second half of their preparation to become such, even without regard to the degree of their being rumination, that the common presence of the planetary body of every being, and in general of any other relatively independent great or small cosmic unit, must consist of all the three localized sacred substances of force of the holy Triamazikamno, namely, of the substance forces of the holy affirming, holy denying, and holy reconciling, and that it must be sustained by them all the time in a corresponding and balanced state. And if for some reason or other there enters into any presence a superfluity of the vibrations of any one of these three sacred forces, then infallibly and unconditionally the sacred Rascoarno must occur to it. That is, the total destruction of its ordinary existence as such. Well, my boy, because there had arisen in the presences of your contemporary favorites, as I've already told you, their further criminal need to despoil the sanctuaries of their ancestors, and certain of them, with the purpose of satisfying their criminal needs, even forced open in the mentioned way the hermetically closed rooms, then the sacred substance force of the holy reconciling existing in these rooms, localized in a separate state, having had not sufficient time to blend with the space, entered into their presences, and actualized its property proper to it according to law. I shall say nothing now concerning just how and in what form the psyche of the three-brained beings breeding there on this part of the terra firma surface of your planet came to be molded. Sometime later, perhaps, in its proper place, I shall explain this to you also, and meanwhile, let us return to our interrupted theme. The program of my external existence in this said Egypt included, among other things, the practice of taking a walk every morning in the direction of what are called the pyramids and sphinx. These pyramids and sphinx were the sole, chance, poor surviving remains of those magnificent constructions which were erected by generations of the most great Akaldans, and by the great ancestors of the beings of this said Egypt, and of which I was a witness at my fourth sojourn on this planet of yours. I failed to have a thorough rest in this Egypt because of circumstances which soon led me to depart from there, and the circumstances that led me to my premature departure from Egypt were, strictly speaking, the reason why the towns of dear Turkestan with their pleasant chaikhanas were replaced, as I've already told you, by the cities of their famous contemporary cultured continent, Europe, with the not less famous cafe restaurants, in which, as I have already told you, instead of fragrant teas, they offer you a black liquid consisting of nobody knows what.